Hey everyone, and welcome to another XIM tutorial. Today, I want to explain you everything you need to know about weapon recoil and how you can use your mouse and the features of your XIM to control it in a much easier way. This tutorial will also work with a XIM 4. Controlling or reducing weapon recoil is quite a complex task, which is why this video is a little bit longer. I have added a video index on the right though. This should allow you to skip to the topics of your interest. Weapon recoil is one of the most common ways that game developers use to make a gun feel more realistic. It is also used as a mechanism to balance stronger weapons against weaker ones. The weaker weapons usually have less recoil and damage, while stronger weapons have more recoil and therefore are much harder to use. In this video I will not only explain you how weapon recoil works, but also show you all the available options and tricks that you can use to either reduce the weapon recoil, or to increase your control over the weapon recoil with your mouse movements. This tutorial will work for any game that has weapon recoil. In most of my examples I will use Rainbow Six Siege and Battlefield 4 though, as they have one of the strongest weapon recoil systems among console games. So, let's start with the first topic of this video. How does weapon recoil work? There are three types of weapon recoil that games usually use. The first one is horizontal recoil, the second one is vertical recoil, and the third one is the first shot recoil. Most games will use a combination of those three recoil types. Not every recoil type can be countered or reduced, so your first step should always be to analyze which recoil type your favorite weapon is using. Therefore, let's quickly look into each of these three recoil types. Horizontal recoil will make your gun move to the left and right while you are shooting. In most games the horizontal recoil is absolutely randomized, and there is no pattern or system behind it that you can try to learn or master. This means that horizontal weapon recoil cannot be controlled or reduced by mouse movements. However, there are other ways to reduce it, but more about that later. Here is an example clip from Battlefield 4. This weapon has a very strong horizontal weapon recoil. As you can see, the gun permanently jumps from the left to the right. There is no system behind it. Every time I reload the magazine and shoot again with the weapon, the horizontal recoil is slightly different. This is why trying to counter randomized horizontal recoil with your mouse movements doesn't make any sense. In very rare occasions the horizontal recoil will only be one directional though. The weapon will then only move to one side instead of a randomized left-right movement. In that case the recoil can easily be compensated. I will show you an example for this later. Vertical recoil is the most common type of weapon recoil and is also the easiest to counter. While you fire your weapon, the gun will continuously move up with every shot. Here is an example clip of a weapon that primarily has vertical recoil. As you can see, there is hardly any left and right movement. For the most part the gun only kicks upwards. In most games vertical recoil is not randomized but follows a strict system with fixed values. This means that the vertical recoil will pretty much always be the same. The result of this is that the vertical recoil is predictable and allows you to adapt to it. It gives you the option to train and master two things. The first is the necessary amount of mouse movement with which you have to drag down the mouse. The second is the moment at which you need to start moving the mouse to fully compensate the recoil. Another side effect is that this makes it much easier to further reduce the weapon recoil with your XIM features. The third recoil type is called first shot recoil. This recoil mechanic always applies to the very first shot of your gun, and reoccurs when you shoot the weapon again after a short break. The first shot recoil usually is a vertical recoil type and will make your weapon kick up quite a lot. The kick up will usually be much stronger than the vertical recoil that will follow afterwards when continuing to shoot the weapon in full auto mode. Here you have a side-by-side example. The left weapon has a very low first shot recoil while the right one has a very strong first shot recoil. As you can see, the right one kicks up much more than the left one. When I shoot the weapon in longer bursts, you can see that once the first shot recoil is over, the vertical recoil of both weapons is the same. This means that when you want to compensate the recoil with your mouse movements, you have to consider two situations. First, you have to rapidly drag the mouse down for the first shot recoil. After that, you continue with moderate speed for the recoil that will follow afterwards. This recoil mechanic isn't used by a lot of games though. Now that you have an understanding on how the weapon recoil works, let's look at the different options and measurements that you can use to control or reduce the recoil. In total, there are 7 possible ways to reduce or counter the weapon recoil. I have ranked those options in an order in which it makes the most sense to use them. Start with the first one and see if it already does the trick for you. If the first one is not sufficient, then continue with the second option. Go through the list step by step and test them in your favorite game. Of course, you can use them all on top of each other, however in most cases the first few options are already enough to have a great control over the weapon recoil. What I will not mention in this video are anti-recoil scripts. Since Xbox Live and PlayStation Network both state in their terms of service that the use of scripts is cheating, I will therefore not discuss this 8th option in this tutorial. Violating the terms of service can get your account banned. The first method to counter weapon recoil is to only use your mouse movements. It is very effective against all 3 weapon recoil types and one of the best methods to control any kind of recoil. This is what pretty much all the PC Pro players do who do not have access to the XIM features that are used in the other recoil methods. As I already mentioned earlier, as long as the weapon that you are using doesn't have a randomized horizontal recoil, you can train and master your mouse movements to fully negate the recoil. If you take your time and train this for a few hours on an empty server, you will start to build up muscle memory. This will then allow you to fully reduce the weapon recoil without thinking or paying attention to it anymore. Here is an example of how it is done. This picture showcases the weapon recoil of the M4 in Counter-Strike when emptying the whole magazine in full auto-firing mode. As you can see, the recoil changes its direction a few times. The weapon recoil for the first 9 shots is pretty much only vertical. After that, the recoil will turn into a horizontal recoil for the last 20 shots. Near the end it will slightly move up again. Now let's assume that this is the recoil of your favorite weapon. If you want to compensate this recoil with only your mouse, then you will have to move it into the opposite direction of the recoil. Here is a picture on how you would need to move your mouse to center all the shots. The moving red line indicates the mouse movement you would need to do on your mousepad. As you can see, the mouse movements are exactly the opposite of the recoil direction. When I flip this picture, it is even easier to see. It now looks like the recoil pattern picture. This becomes even easier to see when I overlay the 2 pictures. The inverted mouse movements are identical to the weapon recoil pattern. I will now flip the mouse movements back to normal again. This is the movement you would need to make on the mousepad to counter the recoil. Controlling such a complex recoil may look difficult, but don't worry, the weapon recoil in Counter-Strike is very complex. Most console games have much simpler and easier recoil patterns. Usually it is enough to drag the mouse into one direction. If you want to use this method, then the key for this is your mouse sensitivity. It is much easier to compensate recoil with a slow or medium sensitivity on a large mousepad than with a high sensitivity. If you aim with your wrist, then there is pretty much no chance to consistently reduce weapon recoil. In that case, I would suggest you to lower your sensitivity. A great way to get used to this option is to run a 10 to 20 minutes training block every time you are about to start your gaming session. After a few days or weeks you will fully master the recoil. The second method to counter weapon recoil is to make use out of the weapon attachments in the game. Just like the first method, this one is also very effective against all 3 weapon recoil types. Next to that, it is the first of 2 methods that also work for randomized weapon recoil such as horizontal recoil. A lot of games offer a weapon customization system, and some of the possible attachments usually reduce or influence the weapon recoil. For example, a muzzle brake in Rainbow Six Siege or Battlefield 4 will reduce the vertical recoil of a weapon. Another example is the compensator, it will reduce the horizontal recoil in those 2 games. Therefore, if your game is using something like this, then one of your first steps should be to get familiar with the attachment system. Sometimes attachments also have negative effects, which is why I recommend you to consult an attachment guide for your favorite game to find out what attachment combination works best for you. The third method to counter weapon recoil is to increase the aim assist. It is extremely effective against all 3 weapon recoil types. This method is the second of 2 methods that also work for randomized weapon recoil such as horizontal recoil. Of course, this will only work with games that have a strong aim assist, such as all the Call of Duty titles for example. Games that do not have any aim assist, such as Rainbow Six Siege or PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, cannot benefit from this method. The concept is the following. When your crosshair is on the target, and the magnetism of the aim assist is activated, the recoil movement of your gun is not strong enough to leave the aim assist bubble. The strength of the aim assist will consume and negate any recoil kicks. The result of this is that depending on how strong the aim assist of the game is, your weapon will have none, or almost no recoil at all. In games such as Call of Duty you probably already noticed that your weapon recoil is close to 0 when you are directly shooting at the target. But when your crosshair is not on an enemy, the gun jumps around quite a lot. It is therefore beneficial to increase the strength of the game's aim assist. There are several methods on how you can increase the aim assist. The most important ones are your mouse DPI, your XIM synchronization value, the polling rate of your XIM and your mouse, or the XIM smoothing feature. Other XIM features such as the ballistic curve or the simulate analog behavior can also be very useful. Discussing the effect of these features on the aim assist would add another 10 minutes to this video though, which is why I recommend you to watch my increase and decrease aim assist tutorial. I have covered everything you need to know in that video. In that video I also show you the best values for each of these XIM features to get the best aim assist. You can find it under link 1 in the video description. The fourth method to counter weapon recoil is to increase the XY ratio of your XIM configuration. It is very effective against vertical recoil and the first shot weapon recoil. This method will make your vertical mouse sensitivity a little bit faster than your horizontal one, which greatly helps to counter vertical recoil. You can use this method for either the hip or the aim down sights configuration. In rare scenarios it can also make sense to use it for both. However, most games have much more weapon recoil when being in the aim down sights mode, so it is usually best to use it there. So, start your XIM manager and go into the options in the top right first. Click on Global Settings and verify that the Expert Mode box is ticked. All of the following features are locked behind the Expert Mode. Tick the box and press the Save button in the bottom right. After that, leave this menu and launch your favorite game configuration. I will use Rainbow Six Siege for this. Go into the editing menu of your game configuration by clicking the button in the top left. When the configuration menu has loaded, swipe 2 times to the right to enter the aim down sights options. Under your aim down sights sensitivity you can find a button with 3 dots, click this button to expand the advanced settings. Scroll down a little bit and you should see the XY ratio. To counter vertical recoil I recommend a XY ratio of around 1.2 to 1.8. I will go with 1.25 for this tutorial. If you end up using a value of above 1.8, then this is an indication that your XIM sensitivity is not optimal, or your mousepad is too small. This configuration will do the following. Whenever you go into the aim down sights mode, your XY ratio will be slightly increased. That way you have to drag down your mouse on the mousepad with less speed. In addition to that, accidental left and right mouse movements will be reduced in their effect, and therefore not screw up your aim while you try to compensate the recoil. Since the sensitivities of your mouse axes are not identical anymore, it may take a few hours to get used to the new mouse behavior when being in aim down sights mode, so give it a bit of time. If you cannot get comfortable with the changed XY ratio, then you can do the following trick. With this trick, the XY ratio will only change while you are shooting. This means that while you are aiming with your weapon in the aim down sights mode, the XY ratio will remain normal. Set the XY ratio of this aim down sights configuration back to 1. After that, swipe one more time to the right. This will open a new auxiliary configuration. Click the Enable button. After that, set the sensitivity to the same one as in your aim down sights configuration. For me, this means I have to set it to 20. The next step is to click on the three dots button right below the sensitivity option. Scroll all the way down until you can find the translator mode. Switch it from hip translator to aim down sights. You can do that by pressing the arrow on the right side. After that, you can change the XY ratio at the top. I will go with 1.25 again. Make sure to use the same synchronization as in your aim down sights configuration too. Mine is already set to default, which is the same one that I use in my aim down sights configuration. The last step is the most important one. Scroll up again until you can see the activation button. Now you have two options. The first option is to use your regular fire button as an activation key. The result of this is that the increased XY ratio will only be active when you fire your gun. However, this will also apply to your hip fire then. Whenever you shoot from the hip, your XIM will switch into the auxiliary configuration with the changed XY ratio. This option is only useful for games where you rarely shoot from the hip. Or alternative, a game that doesn't have any aim down sights mode but a lot of hip fire recoil. The second option is to use a second fire button as an activation key. It should be a button that you haven't bound to any other action yet, and that you can comfortably press to fire your weapon. In my case, I haven't bound the right mouse click to any action yet. Therefore, I can use the right mouse button as the activation key. The next step is to untick the inherit box at the very top. This will allow you to rebind your button bindings. Scroll down again to find the button bindings for this sub-configuration. Here you have to change the fire button at the top to the same key that you used to activate this auxiliary configuration. In my case, that is the right mouse button. This configuration will now do the following. When you shoot with your regular fire button, in my case left mouse click, the XY ratio will not be changed. I can use this button to fire from the hip. If I want to shoot while being in aim down sights mode, I will use the right mouse button instead. My XIM will only change the XY ratio when I hold down the right mouse button. On the one hand, this allows me to aim with a normal XY ratio when I use the aim down sights option of my weapon. On the other hand, I have a better weapon recoil control when I fire the weapon with the right mouse button thanks to the increased XY ratio. The fifth method to counter weapon recoil is to use the steady aim feature of your XIM. It is less effective than the XY ratio but has some advantages in return. Steady aim will basically quantize the directions of your mouse movements similar to an angle snapping algorithm. This will allow you to easier and more consistently move the crosshair down in a straight line. The same applies to horizontal movement. Steady aim will remove small inconsistencies in your aim that prevent you from moving the crosshair in a perfect horizontal or vertical line. This method is therefore ideal for weapons that only have vertical or horizontal recoil. If you want to know more about this feature, then you can watch the Steady Aim tutorial on my channel. Let's switch to the XIM Manager again. You can find the Steady Aim feature right below the XY ratio in your XIM Manager. If the manager of your XIM Apex or XIM 4 doesn't show you this option, then you have to update your XIM firmware and manager version. A value of 2 to 10 is ideal for most vertical weapon recoils. The advantage of this method over the XY ratio is that you will hardly notice any difference in your aim accuracy. The XY ratio will totally change the aiming behavior of your mouse. This is something that the Steady Aim feature will not do, unless you use values of above 10. If you decide to use values of more than 10, then your diagonal mouse movements will start to become a sequence of several small vertical and horizontal steps. The setup of this method is similar to the XY ratio. You have the same 3 options as before to use this method. The first one is to apply it directly to your aim down sights configuration. When I swipe back to the left to enter my aim down sights configuration, I can directly apply the Steady Aim to it. I will go with a value of 5. Just like before, the second and third options are to use an auxiliary configuration for this. I will swipe back to the right to enter the auxiliary configuration from before. Here I can decide if I want to bind this feature to my primary fire button, or to a secondary fire button that I will use for aiming down sights. The setup is the very same as before with the XY ratio. Pick the option that you prefer the most. The sixth method to counter weapon recoil is to use the boost feature of your XIM. Its main purpose is to counter first shot recoil. It is less effective for horizontal or vertical recoil and also has 2 noticeable disadvantages. Overall, I can only recommend you to use this feature if your favorite weapon has a very strong first shot recoil. One of the advantages of boost is that it will give your crosshair an instant movement jump that kicks in the moment you start to drag your mouse into a certain direction. This movement jump is similar to how the first shot recoil of your weapon kicks up your crosshair. Therefore, if you set the boost value to a similar level as your first shot recoil, you can negate the recoil without having to rapidly drag your mouse down the moment you start to fire your weapon. There are 2 major disadvantages though. The first one is that this instant crosshair movement jump will also apply to your mouse movements whenever you change the direction. It will therefore affect your overall accuracy by quite a bit if you use higher values. The second one is that boost will reduce the aim assist, which means that this feature works against one of the best counter mechanisms for weapon recoil. This is why I only recommend to use boost for games with no aim assist, or for weapons with very strong first shot recoil. If you want to know more about this feature, then you can watch my boost tutorial on my channel. Let's switch to the XIM Manager again. You can find the boost feature right below the Steady Aim option in your XIM Manager. If the manager of your XIM Apex or XIM 4 doesn't show you this feature, then you have to update your XIM firmware and manager version. A boost value of 200 to around 500 should be sufficient for most high recoil weapons. The setup of this method is exactly the same as with the XY ratio or the Steady Aim. You can apply it to your aim down sights configuration, or use it in a dedicated auxiliary configuration. I will add a boost value of 300 to my current XY ratio auxiliary configuration. The seventh method to counter weapon recoil is to use a ballistic curve. Depending on what curve you use, this method can be very effective against all recoil types. This method is basically the last resort if none of the previous methods did the trick for you. The ballistic curve basically combines several positive effects. On the one hand, it can increase the aim assist. On the other hand, it will raise your mouse sensitivity in the necessary areas that are relevant to control weapon recoil. The downsides of a ballistic curve are that each game and weapon may require their own curve. Creating and adjusting a curve to counter weapon recoil can also take quite a while. Next to that, your mouse accuracy can suffer if you overdo it with the curve. In the last few minutes I want to show you how to create a curve that can be effective against weapon recoil. This curve is only a blueprint though. You may have to tweak it to perfectly match your game and weapon. The setup options are identical to the previous 3 methods. You can either add the ballistic curve to your aim down sights configuration, or use an auxiliary configuration with an activation key of your choice. I will add the curve to my aim down sights configuration, so I will swipe 1 time to the left to enter it. Click on the ballistic editor button to launch the curve menu. A new pop-up window with a graph in the middle should appear. At the bottom and right side of the graph, you can find the sliders to adjust the curve. Use the slider at the bottom and move it to the right until you can see the value of 26 at the bottom. After that, press the plus button next to it once. The next step is to press the minus button on the left once. The value should now be back at 26. This will create an editing node in the curve. Now move the bottom slider to the left until you see the value of 16. After that, you do the same as before, press the plus button once and then the minus button once. The value should then be back at 16. The next step is to move the slider at the bottom to the left until you can see the value 4. Change this value to 8 now. You can either use the plus button, or directly edit the number by clicking on it. The last step is to move the bottom slider to the right until the bottom value shows 16. Increase this value to 20. Again, either use the plus button or adjust the value directly. The curve is now complete. You can now close the curve generator by pressing the X in the top left. As I said, depending on your game you might want to customize this curve a little bit. Either change the location of the nodes, or use higher or lower increments when raising the nodes. When you have adjusted all recoil methods that you would like to use, then you can hit the Save button in the top left. After that, you can exit your game configuration. If you have any questions about the XIM, or about the methods on how to reduce or control weapon recoil, then just ask in the comments down below. If you liked this video, hit the like button or even subscribe to this channel. Also, let me know if you would like to see more of these tutorials in the comments down below, and I will maybe see you in the next one. Until then, enjoy your XIM experience.